Good evening. We're glad each and every one of you here. If you're outside, go ahead and come in, have a seat. We're glad that you all are all present here tonight, and if you're with us online, we're really glad that you're here as well. So we're glad to have you. Got a few announcements and a few things we need to make everybody aware of, okay? Cindy Owen has been scheduled for a partial mastectomy August the 19th. Jack Farland is going to have outpatient trigger finger surgery. Now, I know that for brother here, that trigger finger would be really important. So I guess Jack's trigger finger too. Tim Beck is recovering from hip revision surgery, and Johnny Copeland was diagnosed yesterday with Lyme disease. So Dalton Colley is recovering in St. Francis, Tulsa St. Francis, on the 6th floor, room 10628. His grandmother, Fran, remains in Muskogee St. Francis with congestive heart failure, so we've got to remember them. Sean Salmon, that's Becca Holliday's father-in-law, is in Tulsa St. Francis on a ventilator after suffering a heart attack last night. So let's remember all of those. Also, pray for our teachers and our students. School starts tomorrow. We all got to drive right and be careful and slow down, and let's remember all of those who are on the campuses starting tomorrow. There's a sign-up sheet available in the welcome booth for you soul sisters, girls 3 through 8th grades. First meeting is September 10th at 5:30 to 6:45. The leaders are Mary Smith, Autumn Keese, and Stacy Myers. Teachers, we need a few more teachers for the new quarter starting in September. It's going to come real quick. That's be here in a couple of weeks. Sign up is at the welcome booth. A teacher for the 3 and 4-year-olds is needed for the next 3 weeks on Sunday morning. So if you can sign up for one of those times or all 3, talk to Dean about it, okay? Jumpstart Youth Rally. Ohana, God's Family. Cost is $50 Friday through Saturday. Meals are included. You got to pay by Friday. Bring an air mattress, toiletries, money for lunch Sunday. See Justin Tellison because the bus is going to leave at 4:30. Okay, there's a back-to-school potluck August the 24th after Bible class. That's Sunday morning. Bring your favorite Italian dish. It's Italian-themed. And please sign up at the welcome booth so that we don't get all of one thing, okay? Have 12 salads. This Friday night is adult game night, 5:30 in the fellowship hall. Bring your favorite finger food or desserts, and there's no children. Sorry, children. Card writers meet in the library at 10 a.m. on the 19th. August the 24th, there's a Devo at Robbie and Lisa Walking Sticks, 5:30. Girls bring cookies, boys bring chips, and appropriate swim attire is required. Devo at Rob and Tanya Wallace's at 4:30, August the 31st, and then September the 1st, Labor Day, and the office will be closed that day. Birthdays: Olivia Benson on the 13th, Ava Elkins the 14th, Lot on the 15th, Jan Carriger, Sophie Ellis, and Mia Hawk. 16th, Junior Castro, Linda Schaefer. 17th, Carly Scott, Braden Townsend, 18th, Jerry Adamson, and the 19th, Raven Smith. A couple of anniversaries: Larry and Michelle Moore, and Bob and Jan Young on the 14th and 15th. I'll be sitting right here. If we missed anything and didn't get announced, if you will write it out on a card and give it to me, I'll make sure that it gets announced when I come back up.
Good evening. I didn't hear you.
Good evening.
I'm half deaf, though. I got an excuse there, but I did hear some of you, but that's better. All right. 8:53, if you got a hymn book there in front of you. I'm pinch hitting tonight for somebody that was unable to be here, so 8:53. When we all get to heaven. Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace, in $867. $867. Let's be standing and remain standing, and Darrell will lead us in prayer after this, and any announcements that he may have other than that. So. Yes. 867. To Canaan's land I'm on my way, where the soul never dies. My darkest night will turn to day, where the soul never dies. No sad farewells, no tear in eyes, where all is love and the soul never dies. A rose is blooming there for me, where the soul never dies, and I will spend eternity where the soul never dies. No sad farewells, no tear in eyes, where all is love and the soul never dies. I'm on my way to that fair land where the soul never dies, where there will be no parting and the soul never dies. No sad farewells, no tear in eyes, where all is love and the soul never dies.
Do have one announcement that happened this afternoon. Rhonda Branscom's brother-in-law, Roy Parson, passed away just this afternoon. Our sympathies go out to Rhonda and her family. If you would, bow with me, please. God and Father in heaven, we come before you, Father, with a list of people who were on our announcement sheet tonight, but we ask for prayers of healing for their conditions. Be with the surgeons who are going to work on their surgeries, but Dalton Colley and Fran, his grandmother, and Sean Salmon, Cindy Owen, Jack McFarland, and Tim Beck, and Johnny Copeland, Father, are on our list tonight to be lifted up to you for some healing and some comfort for each of these people. Father, we do also want to be reminded and pray for all of our teachers. We have a lot of teachers in this church family, and all of the students as they all go back to school. Father, be with them, help them to let their light shine at school, and that people will know that they are the light and the salt of the earth. Father, we thank you most of all for this church family that you've placed each and every one of us in. We're so, Father, so welcoming here, so loving here. Everybody, Father, just gets together really well. And Father, we just pray that will continue, and that this family can be a light for Fort Gibson and the surrounding area. We just praise your name, Father, for all the blessings that you give us, and it's in Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen. Hey, I also know that I'm preaching to the choir, but if you didn't sign up for Connect Group, there's a table out here, and do sign up for that, okay?
All right, good evening, everyone. Glad you're here for class. Tom, I hope you've gotten over Sunday's sermon. Yeah, okay. Tom's a big Raiders fan, and you may have heard Justin's little hit on the Raiders during the sermon Sunday. Yeah, see that in Justin's defense, if you're a Kansas City fan, you hate the Raiders. I mean, that goes way back. I grew up there. That goes way back, and it goes way deep. So you can't hardly talk about the Chiefs without dissing the Raiders. You know, you just can't do it. Anyway, tonight we're going to continue with the Ten Commandments, the fourth one. And let's real quickly read what it says here, because it's more than what shows on the screen. It goes on a little bit beyond that. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. So you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. All right, Sabbath, remembering the Sabbath. Sabbath is the Hebrew word Shabbat, and the basic meaning is just to quit doing something. So you can see where that would apply easily toward this command about the seventh day. Now, this is probably the hardest one to talk about for Christians, because I think we all know pretty well that we are not given the Sabbath command in the New Testament. The other 10 are echoed in one form or another, sometimes by direct quotation or by the same idea being taught very specifically. So 9 out of 10 of the commandments are repeated in the New Testament. This one isn't. So it makes it a little more difficult for us to discuss, because what do we do with it? We just ignore it and move on? Or do we ask, is there something being taught in this commandment that does apply to us, even though the commandment itself is never given in the New Testament? Now let's clear some weeds here just a little bit. When the Jews thought of Sabbath, what were they thinking of? What day of the week? Saturday, right? The seventh day. Right, so for Jews, the day of rest was Saturday. Now, in the early church, remember, all the first Christians were what? They were all Jews. In fact, the reason why Acts 8 and the story of Cornelius is so important is because he's the very first non-Jew or Gentile to be converted to Jesus. A few chapters after that, it goes a little bit wider, because the Christians in Antioch, the Jewish Christians in Antioch, started talking to their non-Jewish friends and neighbors and found out that a lot of them were thrilled by the story of Jesus and wanted to be part of his movement. And then, of course, Paul takes it even wider still. With Paul, in all of his travels, what was his practice when he got to a new town? Always went to the synagogue first. On a very few occasions that worked. Usually he got run off pretty quickly. And as soon as they'd run him off, he'd say, fine. One case he said, your blood be on your own head. And he would then go to the Gentiles and teach them, because they wanted to know about Jesus. But the early church was Jewish. The earliest church was Jewish. So you would tend to expect that their day of worship would be Saturday, because that's what it's always been, right? That's been in their culture and their heritage for 1,500 some years. And yet, it appears that almost like flicking a light switch, almost that sudden, Christians, including Jewish Christians, started worshiping Jesus on Sunday, the first day, not Saturday. Now, why would that be? Okay, Carol suggests because it was the day of the resurrection. All right?
The church was founded on Pentecost.
Okay.
It was Sunday.
Daryl mentions Pentecost, which was a Sunday. The reason we know that is because in the Old Testament, when it's talking about Pentecost, it first talks about Passover, which took place on a Saturday, and it says you count 7 weeks and a day, or 50 days. So 7 weeks would be another Saturday, add one more day, and Pentecost is now on Sunday. Okay, and that's when Peter made the sermon, and people were baptized, and we look at that as the day that the church got started.
That's basically the only Jewish holiday that's on Sunday.
Yeah, Daryl points out that that's probably the only Jewish holiday on Sunday. There are a few of them that rotated. It had to do more with the alignment of the moon and so on. But most Jewish holidays would not have been on Sunday. So you very quickly have this change to Sunday as the day of the week. Now here's what's kind of fascinating to me about this. Look at Acts chapter 20 and verse 7. Acts chapter 20 and verse 7. Now, Paul has been in Ephesus, has arrived, got run out of there. He's traveled on a little bit more, and now he's on his way back toward Jerusalem, bringing a gift from the Gentile Christians. And we know, because we've read ahead, we know this is Paul's last trip to Jerusalem. He's going to get arrested there, and from there go on to trial in Rome and so on. He doesn't know that yet. He's just on his way back to Jerusalem. And he stops off in Troas. And Paul, being a typical preacher, he had a crowd, he talked. He talked as long as the crowd would listen. And in this case, that was till the wee hours of the morning, and a young man fell out of a second-story window and died. And Paul took him up, and he recovered, came back to life. Now, that's the point here of Acts chapter 20. That's the story Luke wants to tell. What fascinates me is verse 7 and the way he goes about this. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread, and Paul began to preach. See, and he goes on telling them what his story he really wants to say. Look at what he just kind of breezes by. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. And he doesn't explain that, doesn't draw any conclusions from it. He takes for granted that anybody reading this is going to know that's what Christians did on the first day of the week. They met to break bread. Now let me go on with the story I'm going to tell. He doesn't spend any time at all talking about what really was a major cultural change for at least some of those Christians, because some of them were Jews. Now, for what it's worth, that episode happened around the year 56 or 57. If you look at 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2, Paul there makes reference to the Lord's Day, which we know is how the church very quickly began to refer to Sunday as the Lord's Day. 1 Corinthians, it was written a little bit before this episode, where in Acts chapter 20, probably around 53 to 55. So here's my point, okay? Jesus died roughly the year 30. Now, we can talk about this sometime if you want, but believe it or not, Jesus was born around the year 4 BC, 4 years before Christ. Okay, it's because the guy that first figured all this out made a mistake, and by the time other people figured out the mistake, so much had begun following that dating scheme, it would have been too disruptive to try to shift it 3 or 4 years. So Jesus was born 4 years before Christ, which makes absolutely no sense, but that's what we got to live with. Okay, which puts his death roughly the year 30. So, 25 years later, no more than 25 years later, a predominantly Jewish movement full of people that worship on Saturday is now so ingrained in worshiping on Sunday that Luke can mention it and take it for granted. In 25 years, this major shift has become something Luke takes for granted. So there's been a big change. Sunday is now the day of worship for Christians. Is Sunday ever called the Christian Sabbath? I've heard that expression. Haven't some of you? You ever read that in Scripture? It's not there. Nowhere. Never called that in the Bible. And as far as I'm concerned, that's terminology is probably better avoided because it brings in too much stuff that we don't need to associate with Sunday. The Sabbath is distinctly Israelite. It was never bound on anybody but Jews and the stranger within their gates. In other words, not a temporary passer-through, an alien who had made his home among them and become part of the community. So if you're going to become part of the community, then you're going to live by the community's rules. The Sabbath was always and only for the Jewish people. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9 tells us that for Christians, the Sabbath rest still remains. It's yet to come. So there really isn't any such thing as a quote-unquote Christian Sabbath, at least not that we experience now. So, to what degree, then, is our Christian behavior on Sunday to be governed by Sabbath rules? Yeah. There is really. I'm going to have to sound just a little bit legalistic here for a minute, so forgive me, okay? There are literally no Sabbath rules from the Old Testament that you can bind on Christians for Sunday. There aren't. There's none. None of them apply. Now, to talk out of the other side of my mouth, I think there are some principles behind those Old Testament rules that we would do well to apply to ourselves in Sunday. Okay, and we'll talk about those more as we go on. But there are no rules regarding Sabbath in the Old Testament that currently attach to Sunday. The New Testament never, ever does that. Paul actually argues against doing that. Look at Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2 and verses 16 and 17. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a Sabbath or a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Colossians was a primarily Gentile church, like most of the churches over, in Asia Minor and Greece and so on. And apparently you've got people there who are trying to bind Jewish food laws and Jewish Sabbath rules on these Christians there. And Paul says, don't let anybody do that. They don't count anymore. They're a shadow of what is to come. The substance belongs to Jesus. So the substance of following is no longer keeping rules and regulations. The substance revolves around Christ. Okay? Now in Romans 14, verses 5 through 6, won't read that, but there Paul talks again about Sabbath and conscience. And his point is, if you, a Jewish believer, feel like you need to keep the Sabbath because you always have, that's just part of who you are, that's okay. It's okay for you as a Jew to do that. Just don't go binding that on Gentiles who were not raised Jews, who don't have this history of obeying the Sabbath. Now, there actually have been attempts, even in America, to bind Sabbath rules on modern day, on Christians. It actually dates back to the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther and Calvin and so on, and it came to the United States with the Puritans, way back before there was a United States. And that's where you wind up. You remember the old blue laws? I used to work in a grocery store in Ottawa, Kansas, and this was, I don't know if they still do or not. I don't pay much attention to the beer display at the grocery store, but at this point, Coors beer came in big 32-ounce jars, or 32-ounce bottles. And if you worked Saturday night, the store closed at midnight, which happened to be when Sunday began. And Kansas did not allow beer sales. So you want to guess what happened around 11:47 every Saturday night? Everybody and their dog who needed a few to get them through the rest of the weekend came rushing in. Some of them had already had too many. And it never failed that one of them would grab that big 32-ounce and drop it. And so I would spend the end of my Saturday shift mopping up beer, sweeping up the glass and mopping up beer. Where I learned to detest the smell of the stuff. And to this day, I can't stand the smell of it. I'm not, you and beer is between you and the bottle and God, but I'm not trying to make any judgment on that. I'm just saying for me personally, I can't even stand the smell of it, and I think it goes back to mopping it off the floor. But that blue law in Kansas, and they used to be stricter than that. There were states where there was no commerce whatsoever on Sundays. And it's been fascinating to me. We moved here from a suburb of Georgia, suburb of Atlanta, excuse me. I would say that Atlanta is a lot more cosmopolitan than Muskogee and Fort Gibson. It was rare to find a restaurant that was closed on Sunday, other than Chick-fil-A. Have you ever noticed how many restaurants are closed on Sunday around Muskogee and Fort Gibson? There are a lot of them. There are a lot that are closed on Sunday. And all I can figure is that the owner wants to go to church and wants his employees to be able to go to church, and I applaud him for it. We can fix extra food on Saturday and eat it on Sunday ourselves, So anyway, but all of that is kind of a carryover from the attempt to bind Sabbath laws on Christians. So let's take a look at this law. And the first question I want to ask you is, think about this. What did God intend when he gave this commandment? What did God intend when he gave this commandment? And there's not just one answer, there's multiple. So what do you think? What's he getting at when he gives this commandment? Commune with God. Okay, commune with God. You need to stop every week and spend time with God in his presence, where nothing else is grabbing your attention, nothing else is demanding. You deal with it. Everything else is put aside. and it's just you and God for a day. Okay? What else is he intending with this command?
God rested on the Sabbath, and he intends for us to rest on the Sabbath.
Okay? Now, when you say rest, I'm going to be picky, and I have a point. What do you mean when you say rest? Okay. So part of the intent is, in imitation of God, we are to take a break from working. Okay, so, and I'm going to put a word in your mouth, but you're basically saying that there was a humanitarian reason, at least partly, behind this commandment. And I would agree with you if that's what you mean. I'm not entirely sure looking at you that's what you meant, but God is saying that it's good for you. He's saying it's not good to work incessantly and never take a break. You should take a break. Now, we'll get back to this in a minute, but to make it even more incredible what he's saying here, you understand that the law doesn't just apply to the Israelites. It applies to their slaves and their animals as well. Now, in the ancient Near East, that was basically unheard of. Animals are literally property. And if they're especially valuable, you might take care of them, but most of them, you just worked them. And if you worked them to death, well, you got another one. And you treated slaves the same way. They were property. And their existence was work. And if they died, so what? That was the way most people viewed slaves, and here God is saying, you take a break, but your donkey and your cow, they get a break as well, and that slave working in your fields, he gets a break. Everybody gets a break. Yeah.
Medical science, from what I've read in the past, says that our bodies are not designed to work 7 days a week. So therefore, God's, for health reasons, is saying take a break. But I'm also thinking about is what you just said. We've been talking about let your light shine. If you're imitating God and taking a day off, then your servants and everybody else is going to see you imitating God and
Okay.
letting their light shine.
He's got 2 points there. He says there's some medical science that shows the incredible value of periodically not working, just allowing your mind and your body to recuperate. I don't know if there's medical science for it. I know personal experience tells me that. But then beyond that, if the Israelites were doing what God said, then their slaves, who might eventually go back home, you never know, or maybe just the peoples around them would notice that they were doing something to imitate God and that they were treating their animals and their slaves differently from everybody else, which was a way of being a light to the nations around them. Okay, what else is behind this commandment? Pardon? Okay. Tell me what you mean. Keep. Okay, so a day where we not only avoid work, we avoid any avenue for sin. We are focused on God, and everything we do is holy. Okay, you know, the Hebrew word holy is kadosh, and it appears that the root meaning of that is to be separate, to be apart from everything else. For example, in the temple, they had ordinary and holy utensils. You know, the holy ones were set apart and kept apart from the others because they were used for things that served God directly. If it was just for regular cooking or whatever, you know, for the priests around the temple, because some of them lived basically on the temple precincts, those everyday dishes were kept here, but the special ones for God were set apart over here. They were holy. So we're keeping that day set apart from all others and staying apart from anything that's not devoted to God, because that day is His. All right? What else? Yeah.
What about praising God or worshiping God with family, whether it's your regular family or your church family?
A day devoted to worship. Yeah. I think one of the clear implications of this command is there's a time for work, there's a time for rest, and there's a time for worship. All three of them get wrapped up in this Sabbath command. I'm going to say more about that later. Okay, a way to trust in God because everybody around them thought it took 7 days a week just to survive. And some of the Israelites sort of felt that way. You look at the book of Amos, I think it's chapter 8. Amos depicts the shopkeeper saying, when is the Sabbath going to be over so we can start selling again? You know, they were just sitting there just almost angrily twiddling their thumbs waiting for this prohibition to be ended so I can get back to business. It's like it aggravated them that they had to take a day off and not make money on that day. Which does imply some trust in God because I guarantee you, without this commandment, there were valuable things that they would have been doing. Yeah.
So it's strange because they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years and they got manna every morning except on the Sabbath. And on Friday, they were supposed to take a double portion and not any other day. If they did it on any other day, it rotted. Okay? So, but for 6 days, God fed them, and then on the 6th day, they got a double portion so they could eat on the 7th.
Yeah, Daryl mentioned something that I have under the heading of, the whole concept here. God very strictly enforced it. He was serious about this one.
Yeah.
When they were wandering in the desert for 40 years, obviously they're not planting and harvesting crops, are they? So God provides them with manna every morning except Saturday. The first Saturday came along, a bunch of people went out to gather, and there was none there. They'd been told, don't expect to find any on Saturday. It won't be there, but they went out anyway, and there wasn't anybody there. Some of them had to learn the lesson the hard way. The idea was that on Friday, you collect a double. But what's fascinating is the first couple days it came, people collected extra. It's like they weren't sure God was going to do it again tomorrow, so they collected extra. And all the leftover was rotted and full of maggots by the next morning. But that didn't happen on Saturday. What you collected extra on Friday remained good so that you could eat it on Saturday because you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, right? And so you go out and do that. You go out and collect extra so you're not working on Saturday to collect any. So God expected this to be taken very seriously. In fact, in Exodus 35 and another passage in Numbers, what happened to people who were caught violating the Sabbath? They were put to death. Right. Right. One fellow was out collecting firewood on Sabbath, and he was put to death. He could have done that Friday, couldn't he? If they needed firewood, he could have done that Friday. God took the Sabbath very, very seriously. Now, I can think of one more thing that we'll come back to later, but I'm kind of surprised nobody mentioned this yet. Do you realize that the Sabbath actually gives approval to work? 6 days you shall work. Doesn't say that that's bad or that that's in any way a violation of God's will. 6 days you work. You rest on the 7th. There is actually something that's blessed about working, and we'll say more about that later. All right. Let's dive into some more here. The Sabbath was the symbol, one of the symbols of the relationship between God and Israel. It is called a sign of the covenant. Now, for what it's worth, Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments, that is not the first time that the Sabbath commandment was given. Notice what it says here. Remember the Sabbath. In other words, you already know about it, don't you? Yeah, so in fact, back in chapter 16, the Israelites were given the Sabbath command. Okay, so it was something that was put in place before the 10 Commandments. At regular intervals, Israel was to turn from the material to the spiritual. They were to think of God. It reminds them that every day is measured and planned by God, reminds them that their whole being comes from God, and that their well-being depends on Him. It's kind of like what Paul taught in Acts chapter 17 when he told the Athenians, he quoted an Athenian poet saying, "In Him we live and move and have our very being," and Paul agreed with that. Well, the Sabbath is kind of a way to remind Israel that everything you're doing depends on God. And again, it was a sign of their covenant, Exodus 31, verse 12 and 17. It was a sign that they were keeping the covenant. So, also, the Sabbath is a regular reminder of who God is. Now, in Exodus, when the Ten Commandments are given, it says, do that because the Lord created 6 days and rested on the seventh. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, where the Ten Commandments are repeated, this time it's linked to God rescuing them from slavery in Egypt. The Sabbath was a reminder that God brought them out of Egypt. But whichever way you look at it, Sabbath reminds you that you worship a powerful, almighty God who has done great things for you. That was part of the point of it. And I hit this a little bit, but the Sabbath is radically different from all the nations around Israel. No other nation had anything remotely close to a weekly day of rest. Slaves certainly didn't rest. Animals didn't rest. But most people didn't rest either. You work 7 days a week or you likely wouldn't survive, is the way people felt. And what's also interesting is most special days in the ancient Near East were based on the movement of the sun or the moon or the stars or whatever. Okay? That's why, for example, you know that, for example, the Passover jumps around months in our calendar, right? Some years Easter's early, some years Easter's late, because the Sabbath is based on a certain lunar schedule, and it just works out that way. I'm sorry, not Sabbath. Passover is based on a lunar schedule. Sabbath is not. Sabbath is based on counting days, and it's the only thing like that in the ancient Near East. Every 7 days, not every new moon or not every time this star is visible or whatever, every 7 days. Okay. The Sabbath is also a sign of God's love and grace. You can't get away from the humanitarian aspect of it. And I'll mention this again. It's not just you Israelites stop working and let your slaves do the labor on that day. Your slaves get the day off as well. Now, I want to make sure I say this correctly because this can be a touchy subject and I don't want to accidentally offend someone. I don't believe that slavery was ever something God desired. Whenever it happened, wherever it happened. I don't think it was ever something God desired. But it is, unfortunately, a fact of human existence from pretty much the time there were humans. I don't care what nation you're talking about. They owned slaves at some time in their history, or they were slaves at some time in their history. My background is Scottish. Scottish people were slaves to 2 or 3 different groups during their time. It seems like it's always been a fact of human existence. It doesn't make it right, but it seems to have been a fact of human existence. And most people treated slaves like property. Like I said earlier, their purpose is to work, and if they die, well, that's just what happens. And I wonder if this Sabbath command isn't a way for God to subtly undermine that attitude. You don't work because you count to God. You're His people. But guess who else counts to God? Your slave does, because they don't work either. They have to get the day off. I wonder if it's not a subtle way for God to make the Israelites see the slaves as human beings and not property. A little subtle thing in there. I think he continues that, in my opinion, in the New Testament. What are you going to do at church if one of your elders is a slave? Could that have happened? There's some evidence that close to confirming that in some churches that was the case. It's real hard for me to call Jerry one of my elders and tomorrow call him my slave. See, on Sunday, he's my leader and my shepherd at church, and on Monday, he's my slave. That doesn't go together, does it? Those are conflicting concepts. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance, which basically means noise in the brain. It's hard to reconcile. And I wonder if God wasn't undermining the institution of slavery. Talking about how we're all brothers and sisters. Galatians 3, there is no slave nor free. There's no Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We're all one in Christ. There's nothing in the New Testament that ever says, free your slaves. But there's a whole lot that says, view them not just as human beings, but as brothers and sisters saved by the grace of God, just like you were. So I think God has had a project for a long, long, long time to undermine the human attitudes that lead to slavery. If you ask why didn't he forbid it, I suspect the answer would be the same as what Jesus said when he was asked, why did Moses allow us to divorce? Because remember, Jesus said, no divorce, period, right? No divorce at all. And his own disciples said, well then why did Moses tell us to do it? What was Jesus' answer? Because the hardness of your heart. Moses allowed you to give divorce because you would not have received the commandment. You wouldn't have been able to comprehend it. And I wonder if that's not parallel to why God never said, free your slaves. Because of the hardness of human hearts, people would not have accepted it. So he undermines it instead. Yeah.
Jubilee.
Year of Jubilee? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the day of Jubilee, every 50 years, well, let me back up. On a shorter term than that, all debts were forgiven. But on the Jubilee, not only were all debts forgiven, any property that had been sold reverted to its original owner, and anybody who had sold themselves into slavery because of debts, they were set free. If you were an indentured servant, you got 6 years left on your contract, it was wiped out. So there was freedom for everyone from any kind of debt or ownership or whatever every 50 years. Now, that applied only to Israelites. I don't know that there's anything that says you would, if you had a Philistine slave, that they would be set free. But your Israelite slave would be set free. All right, so the humanitarian aspect, I think, is definitely part of this day of observance.
So if you roll that forward about 2,000 years from Exodus to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus had a real problem with the Pharisees and the scribes because, how men are. They decided what's wrong. And they wrote it all down. And you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. Well, when Jesus healed the blind man and the man with the crippled hand, both of those were on the Sabbath because they had said, "Oh, you can't do that." Now, they would go get their donkey or I think it's lamb. They would go get their lamb out of the pit that it fell in because that was okay, but you couldn't heal this man from his physical impairment because that would be work.
Yeah,
Jesus had a big problem with that.
Yeah, Daryl is pointing out that the Jews, and I've actually got a big section of my notes about that the Jews had taken this Sabbath command and had subdivided it exponentially and had all kinds of do's and don'ts attached to the Sabbath, and it wrapped them up so hard that they lost sight of doing good for people. So Jesus sees a man with a withered hand It's Sabbath. He wants to heal him because he feels called to help people. And the Jews are looking at him like, don't you dare, that's too much like work. You can't do that on Sabbath. And he heals him anyway. And same with a blind man and so on. But of course, the rules allowed them to do anything that they wanted to do, just not what anybody else might do. But we'll say more about that here in a little bit. All right. The Sabbath was not just a day of recuperation for people who are tired. It was a stoppage that was good for everyone. And the purpose was to refocus on holiness and to think about the God who gave you that day, who blessed that day and gave it to you. The Sabbath was designed to help people become spiritually stronger. And it does that by helping them recover from being physically tired. You ever tried to go to church when you're worn out, completely worn out? It's hard to stay focused on what's going on, isn't it? It's hard to worship because you're so tired and exhausted. Well, on Sabbath, the Jews recovered from being exhausted, and then they were able to worship and focus on God. Yeah. Jack is talking about a time when plants were running 24 hours a day and people working all kinds of shifts. Obviously, some people are coming in, barely got off work. You know, they're Saturday night shift and they're barely here at church in time. And it can be hard to stay awake when you just spent 10 hours at the factory. You got all kinds of stuff that occupies your week. And 6 days, you focus on those things. On the seventh day, you stop and focus on God and establish what your real priority is. And it kind of gives you a better perspective on all those other things that you spend your time on otherwise. I'm sorry? Yeah. Right. Yeah. It reminds you that there are things greater than what it is you've been fretting over all week long, and someone greater than all the things you've been fretting over. Okay, the Sabbath reminds us that men are not mechanical creatures who can grind on endlessly at work. And you're not even allowed to drive your slaves into exhaustion, but everybody gets a day of rest. The original concept of Sabbath was not gloom. It was to make people glad, a day to rejoice in the goodness of God, and a foretaste of the life to come when you would spend your entire existence in the presence of God. And then I mentioned briefly that Sabbath was also an affirmation of work. Exodus 20, verse 9 refers to 6 days of work as though it's natural. It's the normal state of things. When God made Adam and Eve in the garden, you understand that work was part of it from the very beginning. Chapter 2, verse 15, they're put into the garden and they're told to tend the garden. That's work. The curse on Adam in chapter 3, some people think the curse on Adam is work. No. He worked prior to that. He worked prior to the sin. The curse on Adam is that now work is going to be hard. Things that work easy are now going to be difficult, and you're going to sweat, and you're going to bleed. I've been clearing brush around our place. Believe me, I understand about sweat and bleeding. That's what it's like now. The curse was not work. It's God's will that man should work, but it's also God's will that man stop every 7 days to rest and worship. So work and rest and worship are bound together. Work makes you appreciate the rest, and work helps you appreciate the worship. And rest and worship prepare you for work. The time spent thinking about the holiness and righteousness of God influence the 6 days of work helping you be a person of integrity and justice. All right, I'm going to pause there because the next segment we'll be looking at ways the Sabbath was misunderstood, both by Jews and Christians, and then we'll have some closing ideas, but we'll take that up next week. I do appreciate all your comments and attention this week, and I guess that's it. Thank you very much.